Following the Comey line, the director testified a few days ago in the full committee that the FBI had interviewed Mr. Flynn a day before or 2 days before your meeting at the White House, and you just testified that you had told the White House counsel that the FBI had interviewed Flynn and McGahn had asked, how'd he do?
Right.
Did you have the 302 with you when you were in the White House? Did you show it to White House counsel? And had you seen it at the time you went up to the White House?
No. The FBI had conducted the interview on the 24th. We got a readout from the FBI on the 25th, a detailed readout specifically from the agents that had conducted the interview. But we didn't want to wait for the 302 because we felt that it was important to get this information to the White House as quickly as possible. So we had folks from the National Security Division who spent a lot of time with the agents, not only finding out exactly how the interview went, but how this impacted their investigation.
So did you take that summary with you? Do you have any document with you that described the FBI interview of General Flynn?
At the time that I was there, I had notes that described that interview, as well as the individual that was with me, the senior career official from the National Security Division, had been part of all of those discussions with the FBI.
Did you discuss criminal prosecution of Mr. Flynn, General Flynn?
My recollection is that did not really come up much in the first meeting. It did come up in the second meeting when Mr. McGahn called me back the next morning and asked the morning after, this is the morning of the 27th now, and asked me if I could come back to his office. And so I went back with the NSD official, and there were essentially 4 topics that he wanted to discuss there. And one of those topics was precisely that. He asked about the applicability of certain statutes, certain criminal statutes, and more specifically about—
This is the second meeting at the White House counsel's office. In his office again?
In his office again.
With the same 2 individuals?
Exactly.
On the following day?
Right.
And you went back pursuant to a phone call request, or was—
Yes, the morning of the 27th, after our meeting had occurred on the afternoon of the 26th, the morning of the 27th, Mr. McGahn called me and asked if I could come back to the White House to discuss this further. And we set up a time, and I went over there that afternoon, bringing again the same career official with me from the National Security Division who was overseeing this investigation. He had the same associate from the White House counsel's office, and we talked through 4 to 5 more issues.
You could perhaps have waited until you actually had seen the agent's 302 from the interview of General Flynn. Why go ahead of that? Why not wait?
Well, because this was a matter of some urgency.
Describe.
In making the determination about notification here, we had to balance a variety of interest. For the reasons that I just described a few minutes ago, we felt like it was critical that we get this information to the White House, in part because the Vice President was unknowingly making false statements to the public, and because we believed that General Flynn was compromised with respect to the Russians. We were balancing this, though, against the FBI's investigation, as you would always do, and take into account the investigating agency's desires and concerns about how a notification might impact that ongoing investigation. But once General Flynn was interviewed, there was no longer a concern about an impact on an investigation.
Do you know where that interview took place or under what circumstances?
I believe it took place at the White House.
The Flynn interview?
Yes.
Okay. Do you know if Flynn was represented by counsel at the time?
I don't believe he was.
Okay. And the scenario that you were concerned about was that you were seeing all these statements coming from the White House that were inconsistent with what you knew. You presumed that the White House was being truthful, which meant that Flynn was misleading them,
right,
which meant that he was vulnerable to manipulation by the Russians who, knowing what had actually taken place, could call up the National Security Advisor to the President and say, you got to do this for us or we're going to out you with all your folks and your career is done.
That's right, because one of the questions that Mr. McGahn asked me when I went back over the second day was essentially, why does it matter to DOJ if one White House official lies to another White House official? And so we explained to him it was a whole lot more than that, and went back over the same concerns that we had raised with them the prior day, that the concern first about the underlying conduct itself, that he had lied to the vice president and others, the American public had been misled, and then importantly, that every time this lie was repeated, and the misrepresentations were getting more and more specific as they were coming out, every time that happened, it increased the compromise. And to state the obvious, you don't want your national security advisor compromised with the Russians.
Were there any takeaways from the first meeting or action items that you left with?
Well, there was an action item in the second meeting because we talked about several issues, but
to get the order right, you said earlier that there were 2 meetings and a phone call.
Right.
Was the phone call that set up the second meeting, or was there a third?
There was a third substantive phone call. There was a
go ahead
substantive phone
about
call
the
at the
second.
end. Sorry about that. One of the issues that Mr. McGahn raised with me in this second meeting, that again was on the 27th, the day after the first meeting, was his concern because we had told him before that we were giving him this information so that they could take action. And he said that they were concerned that taking action might interfere with the FBI investigation. And we told him, both the senior career official and I, that he should not be concerned with it, that General Flynn had been interviewed, that their action would not interfere with any investigation. And in fact, I remember specifically saying, it wouldn't really be fair of us to tell you this and then expect you to sit on your hands.
Was the interview of General Flynn accelerated once you became aware of this information and felt you needed to get his statement quickly?
Well, we had wanted to tell the White House as quickly as possible, and we're working with the FBI in the course of the investigation, but certainly we did as the misrepresentations.
The first thing you know is that you have information that one thing was said, and the White House is saying something different. Mm-hmm. And you know that information, irrespective of who is involved, needs to get up to the White House quickly. And so at that point, the decision was made to do the interview so that was locked down before you went up to White House counsel?
Right, so that would not have a negative impact on the FBI investigation at that point. And there was a request made by Mr. McGahn in this second meeting as to whether or not they would be able to look at the underlying evidence that we had described for him of General Flynn's conduct. And we told him that we were inclined to allow them to look at that underlying evidence, that we wanted to go back to DOJ and be able to make the logistical arrangements for that. This second meeting on the 27th occurred late in the afternoon. This is Friday the 27th. So we told him that we would work with the FBI over the weekend on this issue and get back with him on Monday morning. And I called him first thing Monday morning to let him know that we would allow them to come over and to review the underlying evidence.
And was that the phone call, or is there a separate phone call?
There was the phone call initially to let him know I needed to come see him.
Yep.
2 meetings, and then a phone call at the end to let him know
that the material
was available.
To see it.
He had to call me back. He was not available then, and I did not hear back from him until that afternoon of Monday the 30th.
And that was the end of this episode. Nobody came over to look at the material.
I don't know what happened after that because that was my last day with DOJ.
Got it. Okay.
That is.